Welcome back to MCB 170, Society and the Brain. This is pre-recorded lecture 4, which corresponds to part 2 of module 2. The title of module 2 is It's Nice to Be Nice. And in module 2, we're exploring niceness, otherwise known as docility, or lack of aggression in general. And our discussion in part 1 focused on the fox farm, a farm in Russia where foxes had been selectively bred to be tame, to be more docile, to be nice. And this process was a great benefit to the fox farmers, who really are neurobiologists and wanted to know the neurobiological basis of niceness. And as you will recall from part 1 of module 2, the main neurobiological difference between the tame foxes and the wild foxes is that tame foxes have higher brain levels of serotonin, the neurotransmitter serotonin. In this part, we're more concerned with the evolution of niceness. How did niceness evolve? Are nice animals the ones who are more likely to procreate? It doesn't really seem so, does it? How did niceness evolve in the first place? Well, to get a clue into that, we can go back to the fox farm. Recall from part 1 that the foxes on the fox farm were selected on the basis of 2 traits: lack of fear of humans and lack of aggression toward humans. Only those 2 traits. And indeed, over many generations, the fox farmers were successful in establishing a tame breed of foxes. But tameness wasn't the only way in which the domesticated foxes were different from wild foxes. The wild foxes in this case were silver foxes. Silver foxes are foxes in Russia who have this kind of handsome silvery gray fur, and these kinds of foxes are often made into fur coats. Are the domesticated foxes gray? No, they're not. Check out these 2 foxes in the picture. One is black with white markings, the other is white with black markings. Not only are they not gray, but they vary in their fur color. How did that happen? How did foxes who were selected on the basis of lack of fear of humans and lack of aggression toward humans turn out to have greater fur color variability than the wild foxes? This seems surprising, but it isn't really. Because compared to their wild counterparts, domesticated animals in general, not just foxes, domesticated animals in general, whether we're talking about dogs or cows, horses, cats, chickens, domesticated animals in general have characteristics very different from their wild-type counterparts, including, for example, increased variation in hair color. They also usually include decreased size and strength and reduced cranial capacity. Compared to wild animals, the domesticated animals have smaller muscles, smaller body size, smaller cranium size, smaller brain size. They're generally weaker and stupider than their wild counterparts. Domesticated animals in general also have reduced aggression and increased docility. How does this happen? How does the process of domestication produce changes in all these different factors? Well, let's consider this in the context of aggression, not just aggression in the fox farm, but the lack of aggression in domesticated animals in general. How could domestication produce less aggressive animals in general? Well, there are 3 mechanisms: deliberate selection, inadvertent selection, and removal of selective pressure. Deliberate selection occurred on the fox farm. The fox farmers deliberately selected for selective breeding foxes that had less fear of humans and less aggression toward humans. Something similar may have occurred in the domestication of the dog. The dog was domesticated from the wolf. Wild wolves, would associate themselves many eons ago with human groups. The wolves would eat the throwaways of the humans. The wolves varied in their temperament, and it's possible, likely, that the humans adopted the less aggressive wolves as pets, and those less aggressive wolves then evolved into the dog. Inadvertent selection is another way to get less aggressive domesticated animals. How would this work? Well, the aggressive ones are a nuisance and get eaten first. Imagine you have a bunch of chickens in a coop, and one of the chickens is very aggressive, and it's aggressively, violently poking the other chickens, maybe even threatening those chickens, maybe even killing some of the other chickens. Well, you want to get rid of that aggressive chicken, so that's the one that gets made into soup that night. What about removal of selective pressure favoring aggression, including the loss of alpha male mating advantage? Well, let's think about it. When you domesticate an animal, you remove the animal from the wild. You put the animal in a pen. You give it shelter. You give it food and water. You make it unnecessary for that animal to have to struggle to survive. It has everything it needs to survive because you've given it to that animal. Furthermore, you select which males mate with which females. You don't leave it up to nature. You don't let the most aggressive male mate with the females. You select which male you want to mate with the females. So you remove the selective pressure both to obtain resources and to procreate. So these three mechanisms together can account for the lack of aggressiveness of domesticated animals. And this raises an interesting question. Have humans been self-domesticated? Have we domesticated ourselves? Why would we think this has happened? Well, evidence shows that humans, specifically Homo sapiens are our species of human. We are Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens show many of the same morphological changes in going from the late Pleistocene to the Holocene that animals show in going from wild to domesticated ones. Okay, what's the late Pleistocene and what's the Holocene? They are geological epochs. The late Pleistocene was the most recent glaciation. It was the Ice Age. Think of cavemen living in caves, bashing mastodons over the head with stalactites. Homo sapiens were those cavemen. They lived during that time. They lived in caves. The Holocene goes from the end of the last ice age until now. So we are in the Holocene. It's the period since the last glaciation of gradual global warming. Global warming is a phenomenon very, very well known to all of us now. Perhaps it's being accelerated due to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is all, but it's part of the retreat of the glacier, which happened probably 20,000 years ago or so. During the last glaciation, the Ice Age, humans were not civilized. We were hunters. The warming of the world facilitated the formation of civilization, people coming together in groups, developing agriculture, domesticating animals, building houses, creating communities. Okay? In civilization, we developed the built environment. The built environment. What's the built environment? Buildings, houses and other kind of buildings. It's also infrastructure, maybe roads, later plumbing, electricity, the internet, infrastructure that many of us take for granted now. It also involved agriculture and animal domestication. And all of this, the built environment, all of these, this infrastructure, all of these resources that we developed as civilization has progressed, has led to the removal of selective pressures. And it's possible that the removal of selective pressures due to the built environment led not only to reductions in size of skeleton, cranium, face, and jaw, reduction in strength, and to the other changes listed above for domesticated animals, but also for the loss of aggressiveness of human beings. It's possible that as civilization has progressed, as we have removed selective pressures for survival, we don't have to struggle for food, we don't have to struggle for mates, that we became more domesticated, that we became a little weaker, maybe a little dumber, and that we became less aggressive. Is there any evidence that that's really true? Well, let's compare ourselves to Cro-Magnon man. Why is Cro-Magnon man called that? Cro-Magnon is just a little place in France. Cro kind of means cave. And Magnon was this farmer who owned land on which they found this cave. That's why he's called Cro-Magnon man. But Cro-Magnon man is basically Homo sapiens. Cro-Magnon man was one of the first examples we know of archaeologically of us, Homo sapiens, back 20,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago. What was he like? Well, Cro-Magnon man was quite impressive. He was quite tall, quite muscular, and probably smart because he had a big cranium. The male Cro-Magnon cranium was about 1,600 cubic centimeters. Modern man, about 1,300. Cro-Magnon man was bigger than us, stronger than us, and had a bigger brain than we have. He was an impressive specimen. Cro-Magnon woman was impressive also, but there was a very, very big size difference between Cro-Magnon man and Cro-Magnon woman. There was a large sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is the difference in size and other characteristics between males and females of the same species. Back in the Pleistocene, back during the Ice Age, before civilization, human males were a lot bigger and stronger than human females. Is that still true? Well, this is what I call fantasy sexual dimorphism. This is a cartoon of Conan the Barbarian, who's like a science fiction fantasy character. He's the kind of invincible guy who kills everybody with one blow and always has a beautiful woman hanging off of his leg. And this is meant as a joke, ladies and gentlemen. This is some people's fantasy. This is not how we really are. In fact, as civilization has progressed, and as we have moved through the generations, human sexual dimorphism has decreased. Male and female humans are a lot more similar than they were tens of thousands of years ago. And here's an interesting fact. Lower sexual dimorphism in mammals is generally linked with less male-male competition for mates. And it makes sense. As males need to compete with each other less for access to mates, that means less aggressive males can have mates. If only Conan the Barbarian was able to reproduce, then all the males would be these big aggressive males like Conan the Barbarian. That's not so true anymore. Many males have access to females. Many males are able to reproduce, even the less aggressive, more docile ones, and they're able to get their genes into the next generation. In the context of Darwinian evolution, reproduction is the name of the game. It's all about getting your genes into the next generation. When the males of a certain species don't have to compete with each other for access to females, for access to reproductive partners, they can get their genes into the next generation. And if many of those genes are more docile and less aggressive, the next generation will have more docile and less aggressive members in it. So why is that? Why specifically do males compete less for reproductive partners than they did eons ago? Why? How is it that less aggressive males can get their less aggressive genes into the next generation now more than they could eons ago? Well, I think a big part of it is the built environment. It is that as civilization has progressed, life has gotten easier and easier and easier for human beings. It's easier to get resources. It's easier to find shelter, and it's easier to find mates. We don't need to compete as much as we used to have to. And probably the first step in civilization was domestication of animals, and specifically it was the domestication of the dog. We talked about dogs a lot in part 1 of module 2. Here's a cave painting from about 10,000 years ago, at the dawn, really, of civilization. And it shows a hunter killing an eland with the help of his dog. Here's a little dog right here. So humans domesticated the wolf into the dog, and the dog helped the human hunt. And dogs are tremendous helps in hunting. More in antiquity than they are now. Dogs made life easier for humans. It turns out that all human societies had dogs, and some anthropologists think that dogs and humans co-evolved and made life easier for the other. While humans may have in part deliberately domesticated the dog, dogs and humans inadvertently domesticated each other. More generally, humans and the animals and plants they domesticate enter into a symbiotic relationship that enhances the selective fitness of both. So maybe the first aspect of the built environment included domestication of dogs. Of course, probably by then we had tools, we had weapons, we had clothes, we had fire. All this was making life easier for us. It was making it easier for us to obtain resources, to obtain food. But the domestication of the dog enters into that. And interestingly, we were hunters and we hunted with dogs before the advent of agriculture. So even before agriculture came along, when we were still hunting animals with spears, we had dogs to help us. So really the built environment, technology, animal domestication, building of shelters, agriculture, these things began tens of thousands of years ago. And life has just gotten easier ever since. With every generation, human ingenuity makes life easier and easier for us. And it makes it less and less necessary for us to struggle for resources to survive. And I think as life has gotten easier and we need to compete less for resources, humanity has become more and more domesticated, more and more docile, less and less aggressive. So I think it's largely due to the built environment, to the removal of selective pressure, which has led to our self-domestication. But that's probably not the only way. That's probably not the only way. As I mentioned earlier, eugenics, in which governments would deliberately promote reproduction among certain groups of people and suppress reproduction among certain other groups of people, actually has happened in history, but it's been relatively rare. Has not happened very much, and it was not ever very widespread. But what about individuals? What about individuals selecting each other? What about deliberate human self-domestication? Could deliberate mate selection, sexual selection, have led to less aggressive, more docile, and even more moral human beings? Well, Miller is a psychologist who thinks that basically morality and ethics, things like kindness and compassion and generosity, are not only nice, but that they actually indicate mental and psychological well-being, mental and psychological fitness. According to Miller, it takes a certain level of social ability to be kind, to be compassionate, to be generous, to be thoughtful. That when you meet a person who has those qualities, it it indicates to you that they are healthy mentally and psychologically. That's what Miller says. He says it's possible that moral virtues evolved to advertise individual fitness. Okay, and here again, fitness is strictly defined in a Darwinian sense as the propensity to survive and reproduce successfully. So, in the Darwinian sense, fitness is the ability to reproduce. David Buss, another psychologist, found that men and women in 37 societies rank love or mutual attraction as the first criterion for choosing a spouse. On what is that attraction based? Appearance? Not only. Money, status? Not only. It's based a lot on how we feel about the other person, whether we like them or not as people. And I think more and more so, we like other people who are kind and caring and understanding and compassionate and generous, who are virtuous, who are moral human beings. And it's possible that in addition to removal of selective pressure, which is making us less aggressive, we're actually choosing less aggressive, nicer, more docile individuals to mate with. And according to Miller, kindness is attractive, that kindness is sexually attractive. Miller argues that displaying a sophisticated, empathic, social intelligence requires the development of a complex theory of mind, which might be easily disrupted by a variety of mutations associated with autism, schizophrenia, mental retardation, social anxiety, and language impairments, unquote. He thinks, or he argues, that people often fall in love based on positive assessments of each other's generosity, kindness, honesty, courage, social sensitivity, political idealism, intellectual integrity, empathy to children, respectfulness to parents, or loyalty to friends. These are all positive attributes. These are all positive virtues. According to Miller, we're attracted to people who display these virtues, not only because they're attractive in themselves, but also because they indicate mental and psychological health. But let's take a look at these: generosity and kindness, honesty, courage, social sensitivity. Do those necessarily enhance your reproductive success? If the name of the game in Darwinian evolution is getting your genes into the next generation, isn't the aggressive person more likely to achieve that? I don't know. How can a kind person, someone who is generous, someone who would maybe even enhance someone else's reproductive advantage at the expense of their own, how can that person get their genes into the next generation? You know, how can you be socially sensitive and like win the battle of reproduction? Well, a very smart guy named Herbert Simon worked on this problem. Herbert Simon is a hero of mine. He's passed away since. He won a Nobel Prize in economics, but he's also the father of artificial intelligence. He's one of the smartest guys that ever came around. And he developed this very simple mathematical model of altruism based on docility. And it's a very compelling demonstration of how virtuous genes could get into the next generation. I'm going to tell you that this mathematics you don't have to know for your test on Friday. You don't have to know it. This is only for students who like a bit of math and would like to work on this example a little bit, because it'll give a lot of insight for relatively little mathematics. Here's what I want you to remember about Herbert Simon's idea of docility in 3 points. First, Simon defines docility as the willingness to assimilate the knowledge and values of society. Docility is the willingness to be influenced by society, by your parents, by your teachers, maybe by your ministers, by the people in authority in your society, and by your peers. What do they want you to do? Well, they want you to be nice. They want you to be docile. They want you to be not aggressive. They want you to get along with others. And docility confers many benefits. If you're willing to assimilate the knowledge and values of society, then you're going to learn a lot. You're going to develop skill. You'll develop friendships. People will trust you. They'll put you in positions of responsibility. If you assimilate the knowledge and values of society, you're likely to end up with money and a house and a car and a good job and social position and influence in your community, right? If you're docile, you'll be attractive to a lot of people because you'll have a lot of resources. So docility confers benefits, but it also can impose costs. Well, how does it impose costs? Part of the values of society are altruistic values, generosity, courage. You might have accumulated a lot of resources because you're docile, but society also wants you to give those resources, share those resources with other people. It wants you to give resources to others, thereby enhancing their fitness at the expense of your own. Society wants you to be altruistic. That's one of the values that it wants you to assimilate. What about courage? What about heroism? Right? The highest value, you could say, is courage, is heroism, is actually risking your life for someone else. If you risk your life to protect someone else, you're putting your reproductive ability at great risk and enhancing theirs. How could altruism in that sense survive the genetic battle? How could altruism on that level be passed on from generation to generation? Don't all the heroes get killed off before they can reproduce? No, they don't. They don't. Most of them survive. Most of them are never put to the test, right? So according to Herbert Simon, docility confers benefits and imposes costs, but the benefits outweigh the costs. If you're a hero and stand up for your friend or your neighbor, you might win that battle, right? Or you might not even be called to do so in the first place. But you've also enjoyed all the advantages of docility. Resources, status, which is very attractive and can enhance your reproductive capability. So that the docile enjoy a net reproductive advantage. In this way, docility, along with the altruism, along with altruistic values that come along with that, would be selected according to Darwinian evolutionary processes. And again, in Darwinian evolution, the name of the game is reproduction. The name of the game in Darwinian evolution is getting your genes and your traits into the next generation. What this is saying is that if you're nice, if you're docile, you have learned from society not only knowledge but also values, including values that are altruistic, compassion, generosity, kindness, courage, heroism. And all those together will actually enhance your reproductive advantage, and all of those traits together will advance into the next generation. Charles Darwin actually distinguished between two types of sexual selection, intrasexual and intersexual. Intrasexual is competition between members of the same sex for mates. So you can think of two rams butting horns, and the one who wins gets the harem. Intrasexual competition occurs among human beings, especially at a certain age, especially around adolescence, in middle school and high school. We'll talk about that in Module 6. The intrasexual competition is sometimes physically violent, but mostly it is not. Mostly it is not. Mostly it involves much more indirect methods that can be very hurtful to certain people. And I think a lot of people are very happy when they graduate from high school and move on to college and are no longer subjected to that kind of indirect intrasexual, between members of the same sex, kind of competition for mates. I think among young adult human beings, intersexual selection is much more common and accounts for more actual sexual selection. It's preference by members of one sex for mates of the opposite sex. Okay? And what do we prefer? What kind of mates do we prefer? Well, most of us would like a physically attractive mate. Some of us might want a rich mate or a famous mate. We're concerned with money and status, maybe. But I think most of us also, if not predominantly, want a nice mate. We want a mate who is kind and understanding and compassionate and generous and brave and courageous. I guess you could say that most of us want a docile mate. We want a mate who is open to assimilating the knowledge and values of society. But do we all really? Don't some of us prefer a maverick, an outsider, a nonconformist? We'll discuss that in Module 3.